I don't want to use the word opportunity in a good way. It's not COVID is not an opportunity. Yay, we had this. Now we have. I just mean it in a neutral way. There's a moment in time now where we can kind of dig into these things because so much of the noise has been paused in our politics, in our decision making, in our lived experience, in our homes, how we care for each other. All that is surfacing. And so how do we convert that into something more permanent? And that for me has been always the core of the work that fascinates me and my passion is, except up until now, things were so stable, right? Systems were pretty set. It was very hard to change things. And now suddenly it's like, whoa, okay, we can suddenly do a whole lot of different things if we want to, if we choose to.
Absolutely. So Yannick, you don't classify yourself as an environmentalist. You were an ecologist. I guess you'll always be an geologist and marine geologist, and also an economist. So how do you see the environment, and how do you see our world as a system from those angles? And then how did you even start working at David Suzuki Foundation, not being an environmentalist at all?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, labels are labels, right? I mean, I think that when we say environmentalist, there's a very particular definition that comes to mind. And of course, David himself is a pioneer from the 1960s onwards into creating an awareness, a movement back then that was, hey, we don't even know there's nature, to suddenly, oh my God, nature is actually really, really important. And so there's in that label, there's a very 20th century definition in a way, and it's needed. It's not a good or bad. It's just not where I've necessarily seen myself and identify in that same way as the activist on the front line, where my background has predominantly been in systems thinking. So a lot of my, geology is one of those earth system science, very holistic kind of approach, because it's very difficult to think or look at the earth in a very reductionist manner. If you're a geologist, you kind of have to put all the pieces together to then get some kind of story out of it. So I think there was a natural tendency in that specific science to not be so reductionist. So that when I started working more in the UN field and looking at all these different economic theories, what really struck me was a systems orientation. You can't just talk about the environment. You can't just talk about social. And you can't just talk about the economy. They're actually all very, very deeply interconnected. And in the case of nature and the environment, we're entirely dependent on it. It does not depend on people, but we depend on it. So finding those layers and then translating that into some of maybe the policy work. Yes, you could choose to make a policy on a tiny, tiny, tiny little individual thing, and then you push on it and whack-a-mole happens, right? You push here and then where else where you don't see a consequence happens. Or you can look at it much more from a systems angle and say, this is the outcome we want. What are all the different decisions that have to be made to get us to this ideal outcome? For me, world domination. No, I'm kidding. I think I was channeling a bit of Donald Trump there. I'll kind of compartmentalize a little bit to where my energies are and when I see. So I'm not trying to say that the ideal world, according to Yannick, must be your ideal world. But let's say from an economy, from a systems perspective, we really are working right now pre-COVID in a situation where the dominant decision making, the dominant, let's say, algorithm of our lives was really, really set by the idea that to get to happiness, to get to joy and well-being, you need to convert nature to money as quickly as possible using the cheapest possible labor. So if anybody on the call is from an economics, take some class in economics, that's GDP. Okay, so how quickly do you convert nature to money using the cheapest possible labor? And technically, it's not called nature; it's called resources. So there's no people and there's no planet, and that was basically the dominant political policy discourse. Your 6 o'clock news, you had the 10-minute business report every day, and it was all about that. And so somehow magically, the more you have of that, the more well-being and happiness and joy and fulfilling lives we'll all have. Of course, there's not been one country on the planet that has shown evidence of that. And so now all of that for COVID has had to be suspended. Right, governments have come along, the economy's shut down. Stop it. Now we're going to have to intervene to make sure people are actually getting what they need, getting the care, getting the health, getting the support for their livelihoods. Everything they're doing is non-conventional economics. They had to stop that whole algorithm so to make sure we are well. So then you kind of ask yourself, if the dominant algorithm cannot even help us during the time we need the most from our economy, there's probably something wrong in the coding, in the algorithm itself. So I think, to me, we have now this chance, this moment in time, 12 to 18 month window maybe, where we can not just think theoretically. We're living through this, right? We're figuring out for ourselves in our isolations and our interactions during isolation, what is actually really meaningful to us, what is essential for us to thrive. Those are all pieces of a new economics, if you want it to be, right? Economics is purely a human construct, an entire little thing that we code. So if we decide that the most meaningful and essential things in our lives are the things the economy should provide for us, then you can reverse engineer the instruction manual and the code that'll always help amplify and deliver that. And I think that's the time we're living in now, where we have finally an opportunity to really have some significant change in that way of thinking. How do you design a well-being economy? And so first, what I started to think about is words really matter. And, I'm French Canadian. And when I do these discussions in French, the different word for economy and economics are very, very different. So you wouldn't be able to accidentally interchange them. Whereas in English, they often are, right? Oh yeah, the economy is doing this and the economics behind the economy. And we're kind of co-opting the two. So I figured, well, let's at least start with the difference between economy and economics. So the word economy, I think some of you might know, comes from ancient Greek times. This is Aristotle. So again, still a very Western philosophical worldview, but at the time it wasn't as kind of divided yet. It was quite a while ago. And Aristotle was discussing the idea of oikos, which was your home, so oikos and nomos, to manage your home. And home has a very broad definition. So it can be, the planet as a whole. It can be your literal house and your family life. It can be the city and the place you live in. And it can even be your inner home, the self, the journey inside. So over the years, all that concept, that interconnected concept, is very broad. But stewarding that is basically what the word means. So humans have always and will always practice economy. So we're not wanting to not do economy. We do economy. We trade stories. We make things. We exchange them. We trade them. Right now we're doing a form of economy. I'm telling you some stuff. Later you'll ask me some questions. We'll have a dialogue. That is economy. That's everything that happens around us. So it's basically the cumulative result of the way you live your life and the way everyone around you lives their lives. So economics, as a word, it's referring to how we think about economy, right? So our 7.5 billion stories, our experience and choices, how we live this concept of economy, how we experience it. So it's basically the study of humankind and the ordinary business of life. And in a way, if you think an economy should only be about converting nature to money using cheap labor, then you're going to design the economics and the model and the rules and the theory to support that way of thinking. Okay, so when I'm referring to a well-being economy, as we're going to get in, that's the outcome. But then, and yes, we might say, well, to have that, you need clean energy and you need these sustainable things. That's absolutely right. And then you eventually need a set of rules that supports that. So like I was saying earlier, that current algorithm, how quickly do you convert nature to money using cheap labor? It doesn't have a planet in it, doesn't even know there's a planet. So you can sort of see the visual representation of that, way of thinking of economy on the right. So some of you who've taken economics class probably have seen this, right? Households, industry, goods, services, consumption, wages, factors of production. There's no human beings, and there's certainly not a planet. And yet this is supposed to explain how everything in the world, the way we trade, the way we do economy, that's it. There's nothing more. That's all we need to know. So of course I was in Waterloo, Southern Ontario, giving this talk. So I actually put some nice little Montreal Canadian references. But this has come, over the last year and a half. I've done some town halls all across GTA, also in BC, and I asked Canadians straight out, what's the purpose of the Canadian economy today? And that little face from that little guy in the middle there, that's what I got. Silence and that face. But when I ask Canadians, what would you like the purpose of the Canadian economy to be? Whoa, like I got flooded, like, all kinds of answers is coming up all over the place, just like a Toronto Raptors parade, everyone cheering. And all the answers, the commonality was, of course, they were about qualities, the quality of my life, the quality of the education, the quality of life that the kids will have in the future, all about qualities. And so, like I said, if we kind of go back to this, I'm really drumming this algorithm down for you. How quickly do you convert nature to money using cheap labor? Where in that algorithm can you account for qualities? Doesn't exist. Okay. And I'll take a pause there because it's important to know the history of this code. So if you take a little programming analogy, we like to put little codes together. Programmers will sit and program code. This code was programmed in the 1940s. 1944 basically was where it was institutionalized. And what was happening in 1944? There was a war. So the end of the Second World War, and a few, the let's call it the people who, I guess, the countries who won the war. Can you ever really win a war? Came together and said, we can't have another war. This is horrible. Like, so hundreds of millions of people dying. This is absolutely horrible. We cannot do this again. So how do we make sure it doesn't happen? So that was the intent. How do we make sure war doesn't happen again on a global scale? And the theory went, the more nations trade with each other and the more nations trade, the less chance you have for global war. And they were essentially proven correct. Everything else afterwards was beyond the original intent. So they weren't even able to imagine all the repercussions and those little butterfly effects, right, of going ripple through the system. So it wasn't that these people were evil or bad. They just had one cultural reference, white Anglo-Saxon European perspective, and it became the dominant perspective of how to run the world. So I say that story because it's a great little moment in time. Apparently all the politicians are saying that we're at war with COVID. We're at war, we're on a war footing. We have the War Measures Act being discussed. We have war powers. Okay, fantastic. So let's repeat what we did at the end of the last war. Let's gather together and figure out the code we want for the post-COVID era. And that's where we stand today. So at the moment, before COVID, you had a lot of discussions, and we still have, about the clean economy, the green economy, the just economy, the sustainable economy. So remember when I said that there's a difference between the word economy and economics. So this is all great. We need these things. These are absolutely great, but these are outcomes, right? And they're incompatible with the economics of today. So if you ever tried, is anybody, I know no one can just jump in and say it, but if you ever tried to run an Android app on an Apple iPhone, doesn't work so well. So imagine all the environmental and social policies, social justice, environmental equity, all those things. Imagine them as apps. And you're trying to run that app on a system that doesn't even know what you're talking about, has no code, has no way of running that. So you might get some band-aids for a while, here and there, environmental policy, clean some air, clean some water, but you're still always fighting the predominant code of the operating system, which remains, how quickly do you convert nature to money using cheap labor? So at the foundation, we joined a kind of global alliance called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And it's a constellation. It's not there to try to have a particular agenda. It's a constellation linking to like-minded groups all over the world, exchanging stories, and in a push to kind of start putting together what could be well-being economies. And what are the rules? What's the code that you would need to implement to start putting that and supporting that long term? So basically, it is all about the update. When you have your iPhone or your smartphone saying you need an update, you don't tend to ignore it. You actually click on, okay, allow the update. Otherwise, eventually, nothing will work. So that's what we're about. And this was all started by a group of countries and jurisdictions. So from New Zealand, Iceland, Finland, Scotland, Wales, all these jurisdictions at the government level started to get together not that long ago and said, okay, there's kind of something wonky with this obsession with domestic product. We need to figure out actually an economy that actually delivers well-being for people. And of course, the well-being of a New Zealander might be slightly different than the well-being of an Icelander, and that should be okay. And so, of course, they were doing that with the OECD over the last 2 years. And now suddenly under COVID, it's like, whoa, okay, so we've literally just paused the old algorithm. How do we make sure we don't bring it all back, right? We want to bring new back. We want to update. We want to innovate. And like I said, this is all because if you want a well-being economy, at the end, outcomes that generate for you well-being, qualitative, measurable well-being, you need well-being economics. You need the code. And so if we all agree that the purpose of the Canadian economy should be to serve you, to generate your well-being, then you have to start looking at, okay, what are these algorithms and the mathematics and the equations? What's our relationship to economy? And how do we think about the economy going forward? So if we want an economy that integrates and internalizes connection, a sense of belonging. Imagine today in our isolated world, belonging and connection is really a hot commodity, right? You can code that in if you wanted to. Again, this is all a human construct. Code it in. You want an economy that embraces participation and democracy in different ways and really involves people at the decision-making level. Code it in. If you want an economy that understands, acknowledges, works with and within nature, actually knows that there is something called a planet, code it in. If you want an economy that is about equity and fairness and justice, code it in. If you want an economy that acknowledges, embraces, brings all that dignity together, the dignity we all deserve, code it in. You know, we're seeing that in our long-term care homes these days, right? Like really seeing what happens when you don't value eldership, you don't value the dignity of the elders in our society. So in the end, a lot of these pillars and more, if we so choose, these should be the outcomes of an economy. We can code that all in to a new economy. I mean, I've only come back to Canada about 2 years ago. For about 15 years, I was living in Norway, working in the UN system, but also very much becoming, without knowing it, very Norwegian in thinking. And what I hadn't noticed until coming back here is, of course, the code the Norwegians use or Scandinavians use when it comes to running an economy is slightly different, not totally different, but slightly different from our own. They're very social market oriented, a high level of trust in governance, very high levels of equitable distribution of wealth, not perfect, but very high levels compared to ours. And so there's a whole concept and examples in some places like that are very like-minded, and then now even more. I mean, some of you may have heard of New Zealand dropping a national well-being budget last May 2019. The Commonwealth of countries, so Canada's part of the Commonwealth, so the first country to do so in the Commonwealth. And again, it's a step. It's not a whole reconstruction, but there was an acknowledgement. If you go online and read the letter of the Prime Minister and the cover letter of the Minister of Finance about why they did this, and I think that's the important piece that we can learn going forward. So we've been in touch a lot with the New Zealanders on what motivated them to go down this path, how they're actually structuring this, how they measure, and we're relaying that to some of the Canadian ministries here who are actively looking for different ways of understanding what is actually a successful economy. So is it literally only the amount of GDP you create, or is it more complex than that? Then we collaborate with groups like the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. So of course, Bhutan gets easily dismissed as a tiny little country hidden away in the Himalayas, and it's a beautiful. I spent over a month there. It's actually a beautiful place, but it's not at all like Canada. It's like, yeah, you're right. It isn't, right? It is a very different cultural background, cultural history, and perspective. But what it does show is if a country decides that it won't measure its economic success in, say, a very Western worldview way, it can. And so they don't measure GDP. They don't calculate it. So basically, they literally have an entire commission set up around gross national happiness. They define it with 4 pillars and 9 domains. Every 3 years is a whole survey process, like we do a census in Canada for population. They literally do a happiness census that's very robust and full of statistical analysis. And they make their decisions based on always doing their best to maximize the generation of happiness. They are not necessarily currently the happiest people on the planet, but they always know where they are on that trend, right? Are they going in the right direction? Is everybody being included in all this? So I think, for us, it's been opening up that those dialogues and those conversations, not always about the outcomes that we want, which is clean, a clean economy. We're not reliant on fossil fuels anymore for our energy. So those are outcomes. But we also then need, how do I make sure that in 5 or 10 years, DSF doesn't have to go ask the government anymore to invest in clean energy, because it'll just become the normality of the new algorithm that energy is always clean and green. You never have to ask for it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers a little bit. We are a democracy. And I think for the longest time, that democracy was very dominated by an older generation, baby boomers, there's a whole reason for that. That's shifting now. The millennial generation and Gen Z are becoming the dominant political force in Canada. And governments are starting to take a clear notice. If you have a voter base that's predominantly saying, well, actually, we don't want this stuff anymore. What we want is this. That's how politics works, right? It is based on those conversations and based on the listening. So the louder the voices get on saying, well, that old 20th century way of doing economics or doing our economy isn't exactly working out for our millennial and Gen Z generation. We're looking for something new, and we're going to vote and support for innovative party platforms that are going in that direction. So that first segment, and I know, youth vote is very low in Canada. It's just not quite there, and I get it. Part of it is a trust issue. Really, does it really matter? Does my vote count? Well, for the first time in a long time, votes now count. Youth votes do actually count because they're more numerous than the boomer generation. So I think that's one part, and how you organize around that, and how you have not necessarily partisan political discussions. That's the other interesting shift that we're seeing in today's world. Our American cousins are going down the path of polarization, and we're seeing the consequences of that. We're fortunate in Canada to not have that polarization the same way, and the more we can move away. So if you want a political discussion about well-being, it'll be pretty hard for anybody on any political spectrum to say, well, I don't want well-being. Well-being sucks. Right? I mean, it's not really partisan. We all want to be better. We want to feel better. We want to do better. We want to have a better place. So there's ways of using that to an advantage of sort of saying, okay, as one voice, strong voice in the voter base, we all want these principles, and here we go. There's also a lot of campus opportunities. I mean, we were discussing a bit yesterday how in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the social rights movements, especially in North America, really started on campuses. That's disappeared over the years. I mean, there's probably a topic for an entire other webinar if you want. But I think bringing that back, that sort of, not always activism in the traditional sense, but that social awareness, that desire to be innovative and progressive. This is the time of your lives when the possibilities are all there, right? And I think rejuvenating campus voices and not thinking of universities only as these industrial education production lines, I think is something that students and youth really have a power to achieve. And again, power in numbers, right? So once you're gathered together in a set of relatively common goals, it's very hard for some kind of counter to come and say, well, if you do that, we're just going to expel you. Okay, you're going to expel everybody? No, right? So I think there's a way of trying, or I would say we have to find ways of rejuvenating and bringing back, not bringing back by redoing exactly what was happening in the 60s and 70s, but by sourcing the fact that universities can be, again, centers of real critical thinking, original thinking, and really representing students not as just students, but as people who you hold the voice of the future. So be that future now. And I think that's where we can start looking at getting politicians to listen to you even more, to students and youth. The debt question is really, really powerful, right? Because now, of course, again, in this COVID crisis, there is an opening, and there's already starting to be youth groups pushing for debt forgiveness, right? If you're going to get out of this long term with a healthy, creative startup generation, out of a crisis that will have an impact, quite significant impact on the conventional economy. If everyone's coming out with massive debt, even worse, right, than normal. So normal, it's already bad that you have that much debt, but now you would be in a pretty crippling situation, both for society at large. So there's a lot of youth movements and even orgs like us. We're kind of pushing for debt forgiveness in different ways, so you can reboot a system without all this baggage. What I found fascinating, coming from Scandinavia, where university is free, when I would mentor students or be approached by graduates about to graduate looking for career advice, I was very struck by the lack of worry. Right, they're not worried that they have to get whatever job right now because they have to pay off a debt. They're more worried about finding the right fit. They're more worried about, well, I don't know if that company's right for me. I don't know if this sort working for government. So it was much more kind of what I call the healthy debates about figuring out the pathways you want to go on. As soon as I moved back to Canada, and some students would come along saying, "Oh, you work for David? Can I have a coffee with you? Can we talk about?" And the first thing I notice is, "Yeah, but I love your ideas, Yannick, but I have to get a job now because I have to pay down this debt." And I was like, "Oh my God, like here we go, right? This is how the first big hook of the old system gets you and prevents your creativity, right? Instead of all these opportunities to open up, now you have these opportunities. And you have to take whatever happens and whatever you get." So I think a whole rethink of that, that kind of burden that's put so early on, on a generation is something that really has to be surfaced, has to be put out there. It is a burden. It's not just about a money issue. It really is. You're preventing the next generation from starting on the most powerful foot he could start on. And that suits very well if you're looking at a very industrial, mechanistic, economy. Yeah, but we only want these students to build sprockets for the next 50 years. Cool. Probably not what you guys all want to do. And not to say that designing and making sprockets isn't a good thing, although robots can do them all now. But your creativity is much more valuable, and your innovation and your imagination. But the economy that we have today doesn't value that, right? I'm part of the 1% who gets to be creative every day. I'm expected. I have to deliver ideas. I have to keep generating imagination and encouraging all the team to do the same. But that's a teeny, tiny, tiny part of the current economy. What if it was the whole economy? What if every one of us was called upon to use our creativity, our imagination, whether it's arts and science or anything else, to deliver? Imagine what we would have solved by now if 99.9% of human beings on this planet were expected to be creative and imaginative and bringing in innovation in all their different ways. We would have solved all this stuff. Might not have made the same amount of $1 trillion for Jeff Bezos, but we probably would have solved a lot of our challenges, and we'd be exceeding and talking about very different things than the economic system today in this conversation. My imagination was I was very interested in astronomy when I was a kid, and looking up at the stars and all that stuff. And so, but I couldn't do math. I still can't do math. And so that was a no-go. And then I found a kind of a loophole. Oh, look, you could do planetary geology. So you still get the nice stuff that you might work in space things, and then you don't have to do the math. But then what happened is when I joined and did my undergrad at Ottawa U, within my first year, I was already hired up in the Arctic with the Geological Survey. And I spent 5 months just kind of, mapping and hiking the Arctic. And I was addicted then to become a field geologist. And then later in the second year, I was the only scuba diver in the department. And so a PhD student needed a scuba diver to do some research in Papua New Guinea. And I spent a couple of months in Papua New Guinea in my second year. I probably learned way more than a textbook, in just a few months of working there. But then I got addicted to the ocean, and that was probably my journey. And my deepest connection to nature is actually the ocean. Even though I'm an Ottawa boy, there was no ocean. But when I discovered there was an ocean, that was it. So yeah, I mean, for me, life's been, the thing with geology is there are very few geologists, and there's a huge need for them. So there was never any particular burden in the sense of finding some experience and getting some early student jobs and things like that, and getting some income, which is very rare in most cases. So geology is quite a unique sector. Again, not a lot of geologists, a lot of demand. And so that allowed me a lot more freedom to then kind of feel my way through different things. But I ended up in the UN for, again, 15 years, purely by accident, or the company I was working for got bought out, and I was going to take a little break and work on a UN project, and that 2 years turned into 12. And so that's where I got my exposure again to the more economics world, the systems world. Went back and did another master's in economics, and went down that path. So I always give the advice that always plan and never expect your plans to come to fruition. Allow yourself to just be open to whatever might come and sound, that's a bit crazy, but I think I can do it. And then just go do it. I mean, my generation, I'm Gen Y, I think they call us. No, Gen X? No, Gen Y. I can't remember. One of those gens. The average is 4 to 5 career changes. Millennials is 10 to 14. And I honestly think that's how it should be. I mean, the more you can bounce around, get experience, share experience, build up a spiral, you spiral up your experience. That enriches the world and enriches you, in my opinion. My parents' generation, it was one job, 35 years. Yeah, it's how it gotta be, that one job. It's just not like that. The world's not like that anymore. It needs to have a constant cycle of new thinking and innovation. Companies are starting to realize that more and more, that it's not enough to retain. You want to retain for a certain amount of time. And it's almost the idea of, okay, now that I've lifted you up to here, off you go to the next level, somewhere else. So don't be shy, I think, of trying out new things along the way. I'd almost flip the question in an interesting way. So as I explained the algorithm at the very macro level, how quickly you change resources to money using nature, using cheap labor, that fractalates down to all the way down to the micro level. But if you're a company, so we call it, the profit line, shareholder supremacy. The problem with the forms of business today, not business, we're humans. We love to be entrepreneurial. We're curious. We want to innovate. And so we created something called the private sector, and then we defined it with a certain set of rules way back when. I mean, most of the corporate law rules have been changed since the late 1800s. And so we're operating with an instruction to business that the only reason business exists is to generate money. So the algorithm comes back down. And so the argument isn't that people in the business want to do good things. They don't, very few that I've ever encountered want to wake up in the morning and say, how can I destroy the world today? No, right? A few psychopaths here and there, but they're pretty rare. So people in business want to do good, as we all do, right? They go home to their families at night, and the same caring and love and compassion is there. The problem is the business code doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. There's only one reason for business: profit. And the irony is the word profit is an old French word that it means for progress. It has nothing to do with money. So very odd little quirk there. So I think when you're looking at startups and entrepreneurship, the biggest impediment to, let's say, if you want to call it sustainability or business for purpose, is there's very few legal forms of business that actually allow you to do that. right? You're starting to see the discussions on B Corps. You're starting to see the discussions that a lot of social enterprises have been around, but it's still a challenge, right? It's still not the dominant idea. When somebody says business, they're thinking profits, right? Margins, shareholder value. These are very old concepts, and they're not aligned necessarily with what you feel as an entrepreneur. So then you're kind of stuck into this cycle, right? Or you come up with a great idea, a tech world, and hopefully Google will buy it. Well, Google only exists to make more and more and more money. There's no purpose, right? The people might, but Google itself as an incorporated entity, there's only one thing it's measured against. So we can recode how we measure the success of a business. A business can't do that. Society has to, right? This is corporate law, governance law, tax law, fraud law, all those laws. That society holds that. So how do we work a lot with some businesses who actually want those codes to change. They will lobby government to say, make it easier for B Corps to dominate over S Corps. So S Corps are the standard corporations, public, they're the ones we hear about traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. B Corps are like the Patagonia, the business for a purpose kind of model, but it's not actually a full-blown legalized model. So how do you make that the normal model, right? So it doesn't say, we're not anti-business. Business is business. Just like economy, there'll always be economy, there will always be business. But if you align it with purpose and you embed that purpose in its instruction manual, that's how you have the most influence for your ideas to always be aligned with real well-being purpose long-term. I mean, it's hard question to answer. Obviously, opportunities came along because, like I said, there was not a lot of geologists available in Canada, and a whole lot of demand. So it certainly opens up a lot of avenues when people do want your skills and applied. But I think that the other part too is just not being afraid of. I challenge a lot of even traditionally, like how we do things. Even in the companies I worked for or government. And if you challenge in a constructive way, in a generative way, you'll get the response of, oh, I never thought of it that way. Let's talk more. And I think that's an important piece that, yes, there's always that balance between towing the party line or towing the company line, and then challenging the company line. And it's the how you, or even society, right? How you challenge society is perhaps more important than challenging society, right? It's the how. So how do you invite in a conversation? Are you going to go and be anti-oil? Well, we've decided to be pro-oil worker. So those subtleties of challenging, don't bail out the oil companies, but bail out the oil workers. We were alone on that a few weeks ago, but now it's kind of caught up, because in the end, we're there to support human beings and people and all that. So I think that's sort of where, for me, the career path has been about just not always. I like to be challenged, and when I'm not, I feel I've done the most I can do in a role, and then I move on. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps, but if I look back again, because just open yourself up to all the possibilities and pathways. Because again, I didn't start off going down a path of environmentalism or sustainability and all of those. Those became things, outcomes later. I think for me, it was always about curiosity. So if I had one advice to give myself back, is be even more curious, and challenge. Just don't take the textbook in your classroom as the holy writing. Take it as a challenge to deconstruct and critique. And so whether it's economics or whatever science or whatever philosophy, art, history, whatever you're in. Well, okay, history might be a bit harder to challenge, but anyways, you know what I mean. So be challenge it. Don't take it as, oh, the older people, or they must be right because they're teaching us. Meh. I think that's the beauty of especially the world we now live in, this hyper-connected world where you can reach out to Australia, Malaysia, China anytime you want, right, and exchange that information and knowledge. We've never had that in the history of humanity, so we're not even scratching the surface of what that really means, other than than sending kitty cat videos. So if we can elevate that now to that hyper connection, to really channeling our amazing creative powers and energies, I mean, there is nothing we can't solve. And I think it's also looking at not being afraid to look at the intuitive, the emotional. So in Western education, we're taught to ignore emotion and intuition as non-informative pieces. They're very subjective. So that's what this is. So you only think brain is important, brain is king. Brain isn't. So if anything I can give advices now is to realize a human being involves at least three parts: emotion, heart, emotion, intuition, and brain. So the three kind of things that have to work together. So figure it out. Find ways of amplifying your intuition. You know, gut instinct is actually a real thing. Amplifying your emotional intelligence, your cultural intelligence, because I think, you know, that's what shortchanged us. Certainly when I went to school, it wasn't any of that. And then only later in life did I realize, wow, 2/3 of the information that I have access to, I've been taught to ignore, and that's at our detriment. So I think if you're able to embrace that across disciplines, you know, everyone's going to be a specialist in something, but don't be afraid of reaching out into something that you are super curious about, that you might think, oh my God, I'm going to be judged, that's so weird. Go for it. That's probably a good, if your inner voice is saying it's going to be weird, that's the thing you got to go for as well. Because that amplifies and connects maybe and gives a more rich environment for maybe your specialty to exist in. So yeah, that's the kind of advice I'd certainly give back to myself, is like, find a transdisciplinary school and do it all over.
Thank you.